Hi there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay from SpeechKids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And today we're talking to Dr. Nina Kayce. Hi, Nina.
Hello.
Thank you for coming, or for joining us on Zoom here.
Thanks for having me.
I was excited that we could do this. Tell me who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I am a licensed psychologist. My specialty is clinical psychology. And within that, my specialty is also children. So I love kids. I love working with kids. I've always worked with kids. So I kind of knew that's where everything was headed. Right now, my practice really focuses on psychological assessment. Anywhere between the ages of 5 and up, even the big kids, aka college students. It's a pretty rewarding job, and I love it. And it allows every day to be sort of its own unique day, and every family is their own unique family. It's a great profession.
And so when you say your practice is mostly based in assessment, what does that mean, and why do people come to you? What are they asking?
Wow, so that's a great question. I think I always start off, so when a family calls me and they'll say, we were referred to you because so-and-so thinks our child needs testing. That's a pretty broad statement. And what I've learned is that before I can even get into any of the nitty-gritties, I really need to tease out what that referral question is, because assessment can really mean a lot of different things. Sometimes people just sort of throw that term around, and not necessarily parents, pediatricians, therapists, everyone's just kind of like, I'm going to refer you to testing. Well, testing can cover lots of different domains. Sometimes kids are referred to me because a parent sees that they're struggling in some way, or a teacher is noticing that. And so the assessment maybe is focusing on, is there a learning disability present? Is this child on the autism spectrum? Does this child have an attention disorder?
And I'm going to stop you. Sorry. When you say they're being referred to because of the parent or the teacher suspects that there's difficulty, usually that means they're acting out somehow in class, or
so that would be more like a behavioral referral, or they just notice that they're struggling. You know, this child is performing on grade level when it comes to math, but we've noticed that when it comes to the language-based learning, the reading, the writing, this child really is struggling. They're underperforming based on what we would expect. And so if there is a concern about a learning disability, that would be something that would be very appropriate for testing. Or if, let's say, this child actually academically is fine, but they really are having difficulty connecting with peers, and what is that about? Or if, let's say, a child just is really bright but has a difficult time with focus or executive functioning. You know, my child is so bright, but it's like, torture trying to get them to focus for a couple minutes to just get this assignment done. Or they get overwhelmed by that.
Can you talk a little bit about, because I think this is something that parents often don't either know or understand, this notion of a discrepancy. Like, isn't it just they're smart or they're not? And of course I'm leading you because I know the answer is no, but how is it that, you can be very, very bright and have so much trouble learning, or have an excellent score in math and not be able to read? What's going on?
It's amazing. It's the brain. So the brain is, a lot of times people kind of put all this emphasis on IQ. My child's IQ, but that number, honestly, doesn't really tell us very much.
As the psychologist.
Yeah, sorry, guys. When you meet with me, I'll tell you real fast, this is one number, but this number is really made up of all these other numbers. And really, to understand your child, even these 5 numbers I'm telling you about, that doesn't even scratch the surface. So what we know about the brain is that it's so complex. It's so, unique to every single person. Everyone has their own unique profile. So yes, there are people that have very, very strong skills in certain areas. And maybe other areas are just sort of average, and that's great. Average is what we tend to expect for somebody's age. So sometimes that can be the discrepancy, and that causes difficulty for a child. Sometimes the area of weakness is below what we would expect for their age. And what we like to say typically is there's a couple things we need to look at when we're looking at profiles. What is age appropriate, what's above age appropriate, and what's below age appropriate. And just based on those profiles, a child's going to present very differently. If their weakest point is actually several years behind or delayed for their age, even though, let's say, the discrepancy of scores is the same, that's going to look so much different than a child that's average, and then we're comparing that to something that's very high, very well developed. Mm-hmm. So that's why the testing is really helpful, because it kind of isolates different areas, and we measure each of those areas, and then we get a profile. Mm-hmm. And every person's profile is their own.
And so what are some parts of an assessment? And I know they're going to be different for depending on what the complaint is. Mm-hmm. But how many different parts are there? How does that work? Somebody calls you, and then what?
Yeah, so typically, there's 3 parts. Part 1 is an interview. So that's really when we sit down, we call it a diagnostic interview. We sit down and we go into the history, we get into when did you start noticing difficulties, when did you start having concerns, when did the teachers start having concerns. So we get into the history of sort of what's been going on, what's happening now, and get into all of those specifics. Then we move on to the second part, which is the actual assessment. So that is where I administer different measures that kind of look at different areas, different domains. And that's the part that you're talking about that's very much tailored to what's the referral question. If a child's coming in with a possibility of dyslexia, then I'm going to give a lot of reading measures. Still give other things, but really that's going to be something I want to focus on. So we do the in-person testing where I administer a lot of measures, very interactive. A lot of the measures are developed in a way where I sort of present a question at a time and things like that. And so we work together, the child and I, in my office. That's sort of one part of the testing where we get that performance-based measure. Then we also do rating forms. So rating forms are really helpful, right? Because what do rating forms tell us? They say, okay, here's what your teacher thinks is going on. Let's take his or her concerns or ratings of your emotional, behavioral, social functioning, and let's compare that to what's sort of typical. And so that gives us a nice profile of, okay, again, this is what the teacher thinks, in these areas, the child's performing right where we would expect. These areas, the child's maybe a little advanced, and then these are the areas where we're seeing some difficulty, and gives us an idea of severity, the way that the scores sort of fall. So that rating form.
My guess is using the sort of your performance measures matched against what's really a functional measure through the rating scale. In other words, performance is I sit down and I can spew whatever, I can answer questions. But if I'm in a classroom, that's more of a functional environment, right, in daily life. And if those two things are really different, then there's a breadcrumb there, and you've got to go follow that breadcrumb to figure out. Yeah?
Lots of breadcrumbs, definitely, right? I mean, it's really, and in addition to the teacher ratings, we're also getting parent ratings, and we're also getting self-report. And so that's, part of this puzzle that I try to get all the pieces and integrate together, including the history. Because it is the testing, a lot of times parents are like, well, why do we need to do all these rating forms? It's you're just going to work with my kid. You're going to find out who they are. You'll see for yourself. And I'm like, actually, I'm not going to see for myself, because this is a very controlled environment. It's just the two of us. I am cheerleading your child through all of these measures. I'm not going to let them break down. I'm not going to let them feel bad about themselves. I'm going to make this as fun as I can. And get those measures of okay, in an optimal environment like this, where are things functioning? And then I kind of need that reality check of okay, that's great that your child was able to focus with me, with my pom-poms and everything, but how is your child focusing in a classroom with a bunch of other kids where the setting is not as flexible as it is in this type of setting? And do these scores match up? And like you said, if they don't, that's a very important breadcrumb that I need to kind of look into further to figure out what's going on there. Is the child unhappy in the classroom? Is the child, unfocused in the classroom? Is there other sort of factors in play? All those things. It kind of gives me a good starting point.
And then, so you throw all that stuff in the hopper, and what happens next?
I bake it for 350 for 20
for 3 days.
Check on it once in a while. So after I have all of the scores, I create a template, and then we set up what I call a feedback session. So this, or a reunion special, I actually call it also that sometimes. So we meet again, so same group of the parents and we meet again, and we go over all the results, including clinical impressions, recommendations. Sometimes families really want to get into every single score, and that's okay. And then some families are more big picture, because they know at the end they're still going to be getting this very comprehensive report. I always tell families, don't feel like, this is your one time to hear this information, and if you don't hear every single little detail, you're not going to get it, because there's literally a cheat sheet coming your way that has all the same things I'm just saying right now. And sometimes families just want to kind of hear it. Sometimes they want it to be more of a conversation. But typically, I let the families lead the way. Sometimes the child comes to that appointment. I would say typically with much older kids, 13 and up, they'll come to that feedback appointment, and then that looks very different. Then we don't really talk about scores. We really focus more on, okay, these are the problem areas that you were saying you're experiencing. This is sort of what I saw in the testing, and so what do we do from here? So then after we sort of have that feedback session, everything then gets summarized and repeated in a full comprehensive report, which then can be shared with all relevant parties like school, pediatrician, therapists, etc.
And when you give that report, does it have goals in it already, or do you sort of hand that report off to the therapist, because you are not doing any ongoing intervention? Is that right?
That's correct. So I kind of tell families to sort of see me as more of a consultant. I'm kind of coming into this, doing my thing, and then kind of giving everybody the information that they need to then move on to the next step. So I give I would say, the feedback's been that I give a long list of recommendations.
Okay.
And I kind of tell families, don't feel like you literally have to do every single one. Prioritize what you feel like makes sense for how your family functions right now. Like, yes, I might tell a family that, okay, these are the things I think your child would benefit from: speech therapy, occupational therapy, for these reasons. But this is all, and this is all in the report, because if you share this with the pediatrician, I want the pediatrician to also have that same information. But realistically, I completely understand, as a parent myself, like, you can't do all those things at once. So let's maybe start with the speech therapy, see how that goes, and then talk about adding on the other recommendations as we move forward. Especially when it comes to school, the recommendations have to be in the report, so that the family then can use that information to advocate for a 504 plan, an IEP plan, etc. So there's a lot of recommendations, and we talk about, don't get sticker shock, it's going to be okay. It's just, I want to make sure everything's there so you can refer back to it.
Let's talk about 504s and IEPs for just a second. How many, what percentage of the families, or maybe not what percentage, but how many people are coming to you because they're looking for that? Or what, do they already have an IEP, or are they seeking documentation that will allow them to get one?
That's a great question. So I would say,
and I'm just going to pause, hang on, sorry. IEP, Individualized Education Plan, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, so IEP. 504 is like IEP light accommodations for children who struggle to learn in a traditional environment. Sorry. So
Yes, very important. I mean, I feel like sometimes I throw those around and people are like, oh, 504. What? So definitely. I would, it's interesting. I tend to see, I guess to back up, the school should have the responsibility of doing this type of testing. And I know we're both kind of smiling when we say that, because they're not just going to test your child because you're asking for it. They're going to test your child because there seems to be good reason to do that. So some families are able to go that route. The teacher agrees that there's an area of difficulty, the school agrees, that the IEP team agrees. I tend to see the families that don't get to go down that road. The child is struggling, but the school comes back and says, well, we still think this is okay. We think this still falls within the low end of the average range, or it still meets expectations, even though it's kind of at the end of that. And the families are sort of like, what are we going to do? Do we wait until our child fails or starts to get really disengaged when it comes to school, or starts to act out when it comes to school, because this is where the things are headed. So that's where families will come to me for an outside evaluation. So, and I would say, sometimes I see families that have had 504 testing done. It tends to be pretty minimal. They don't have the luxury of being able to test kids for like a full day or 2 full days like I do. So it tends to be very focused, IQ, and maybe some academics, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
So the families that I see, they maybe still have that information, and then I'm able to kind of supplement from there.
Yeah.
Whether the child, has a specific type of dyslexia, or is there an attention issue or an executive functioning issue that's also present. I'm able to kind of tease things out moving forward.
Yeah, and that's super interesting, actually, just from a school system, and what their mandate is, and then private practice and what your mandate is, which is really you can zero in on sort of those those discrepancies. And if there's a big discrepancy, and this happens all the time, right, with twice exceptional kids, where they're highly gifted in one area or in certain things, and then they're at average, right, in other areas, and that discrepancy, the size of that discrepancy, can really indicate that there's a dysfunction there, and that needs to be treated. That will never happen in the school, because as soon as you're above average or at average, they cut you off, no matter what the discrepancy in your score is, until you fail. And so what I hear you saying is you're sort of picking up the slack in some ways for those families.
Definitely. The last thing I think any parent wants is for their child to have to fail in order to then receive the attention that they really should be receiving. Yeah. And one thing I also kind of always share with families from the beginning is that the school doesn't have to accept my testing. The school always has the right to do their own testing. It's never happened. I think they basically see my report and they're like, there's nothing else for us to give. This lady already gave it all. But if for some reason the school disagrees with the findings of the report, then they always do have the right to do that. But they would be at the school's own cost. So it's not something that the family would then have to pay for a second time.
And when families come to you, they are paying for your services, yes?
They are, yes. So I'm fee for service. So I kind of have very basic sort of fee structures of like, okay, if we do this type of package, it looks like this. If we do this type of package, it looks like that. Yep. I don't charge by the hour, just because it's so hard for families and for me to estimate what things will look like. Every child's sort of unique. Some children I think are only going to take 2 hours for something, and then they end up taking 3 or 4. So I kind of keep it very simple. It's either 1 day of testing is this, or 2 days of testing is this. And I can always tell the family that ahead of time, before we even move forward, that this is how much it will cost.
And testing is all in person, is that right? The formal measures?
Yes, so testing is all in person. There are some individuals that are doing the remote testing. That's become a big thing with COVID. But I've been able, with the flexibility of my office, having my own office, and being really the only person that's been coming into our suite, I've been able to really do this safely with a lot of different precautionary measures in place, which has been nice. I completely understand why people do the testing remotely. It makes a lot of sense. For me, I really feel like I need to see that child and interact with them with the measures, especially with it being such a long day. Everybody gets fatigued. So it's kind of nice to say, what, let's just take a break from this and let's do a quick drawing. Let's do some jumping jacks. All that just face-to-face interaction that I really love, that lets me get to know and really create like a nice connection with the child that I'm working with. They're working really hard in here. It's work.
Well,
We call it fun, but it's work.
Yeah, and one of the reasons you and I like each other so much professionally is because you have that same interest in the kids that I do too, which is like, you're trying to see like, okay, who are you? What are we doing here?
It's really fun. I mean, it's like, I always thank them at the end, like, thank you for spending the day with me. And it's amazing because, sometimes they'll say, can I come back? And I'm like,
I just made your brain work really hard. Are you sure you want to come back?
Yeah. Parents are like, no, we're good. We got everything we needed to get done.
I'm going to include all this information in like the show notes, but if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
So I have a website. That's probably the best place to start. It has a lot of information about my practice, my fees, my profile. So it's www.mdchildpsych.com. So MD as in Maryland, child, and then PSYCH.com would be the best place to start. And then you can always call me or send me an online contact, and then I'll follow up.
Perfect. Nina, thank you so much for joining me today. This was fun.
This was great. Thank you for having me.